Today's program is brought to you in part by Manzanita Papers, a literary subscription box dedicated to incredible books that have flown under the radar. Each month, a different writer selects a book they cherish and writes a personalized introduction about why you might too. With each month's book, subscribers receive this personalized introduction to it, as well as custom artwork based on the book itself in the form of postcards and bookmarks. So far this year, readers have been treated to Walking on Cowrie Shells by Nana Nkweti, Revenge by Yoko Ogawa, Silk Poems by Jen Bervin, and Labrador by Catherine Davis, with personal introductions by writing luminaries such as Karen Russell, Kate Bernheimer, and Ander Monson, writing about the books they love, books that deserve more love that they want to share with you. If you'd like to learn more, or if you'd like to be surprised and delighted by some great book mail each month, find Manzanita Papers on Instagram or visit manzanitapapers.com to subscribe now. Today's episode is also brought to you by Courtney Mom's The Year of the Horses, which Danny Shapiro calls searing, lucid, tender, and wise. The memoir tells the story of Mom's return to horseback riding after many years away, charting how she finds her way back to herself, not only as a rider, but as a mother, wife, daughter, writer, and woman. Alternating timelines and braided with historical portraits of women and horses alongside history's attempts to tame both parties, The Year of the Horses is an inspiring love letter to the power of animals and humans to heal the mind and the heart, says Lisa Taddeo. Gorgeously written, wry but loving, heartbreaking, and most of all roving, The Year of the Horses is a memoir of power and beauty and pain that moves across the world like the beautiful horses that carry it. The Year of the Horses is out on May 3rd from Tin House and available for pre-order now. Today I'm excited to welcome Cristina Rivera Garza back to the show for her new and selected short fiction with Dorothy Project, as the second half of the Dorothy Project doubleheader following the conversation with Karen Balin's Revenge of the Scapegoat, the other book Dorothy released this spring. Cristina's work holds a special place in my heart. I love that she writes across all genres, poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, and that within each, she works against what defines them as such. But also the range of her register, from fantastical, uncanny fiction to scholarly work, deeply philosophic and intellectual work that feels somehow still in conversation with the mysteries of her fiction. So one particular treat of this new and selected is that it's an opportunity to step back and look at the evolutions. And in Cristina's case, we could say also mutations and re-envisionings of a writer's work over 3 decades, and then step forward at various points and see if what we see in one era or another looks different now. Cristina publishes with a wide variety of presses, but the last time she was on the show, coincidentally, it was also with a book of hers from Dorothy, The Taiga Syndrome, which perhaps is a sign, since Dorothy puts out 2 books a year, both by women, and somehow both of these books are in probably episodes back-to-back this spring. As I mentioned in my intro to Karen Balin, as part of this Dorothy celebration, they sent me a copy of each of their entire back catalog to date, all 22 books, to divide into various bundles to offer to you, the listener, who hasn't quite yet become a listener supporter. Karen describes Dorothy as the great defender of the sentence, and I do think that this is one really true way to frame the writers they publish, and that so many of us love. Women writers with a distinctive style and voice and syntax one to the next. Language-forward books, which I had the pleasure of grouping into these bundles. From a surrealistic themed bundle with Cristina's Taiga Syndrome, the complete stories of Leonora Carrington, and Sabrina Ora Mark's Wild Milk, to the largest bundle of 7 remarkable stylists, including Amina Kane, Azarine van der Vliet Olumi, to Nell Zink and Jen George. Last time Cristina was on the show, she read 3 sections of her long poem, Third World, for the bonus audio archive. And that's definitely worth seeking out. This time, the bonus audio is a long-form conversation with her longtime translator, Sarah Booker. This is a particularly great complement to the conversation with Cristina, a conversation that is very much engaged with questions of authorship and identity, of relationality and translation. And with Sarah, we talk about the horizontal feminist ethics they operate under when they work together, among many other things. To check out how to subscribe to the bonus audio and all the other potential benefits of joining the Between the Covers community, including this largesse of Dorothy Project books, head over to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's conversation with Cristina Rivera Garza. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest, one of the most important contemporary Mexican writers, the only writer to win the Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Prize twice, is novelist, short story writer, essayist, poet, editor, and translator Cristina Rivera Garza. Rivera Garza has lived and studied in both Mexico and the United States, receiving degrees in Latin American history. She's also been a professor in both Mexico and the United States of history, literature, and creative writing. And her work, much like her own life and the life of her migrant ancestors, is writing that is concerned with, interrogates, and crosses borders, whether the borders between English and Spanish or the United States and Mexico, and those between writer and translator, or the borders between the human and the non-human, the forest and the city, or with regards to questions of gender, indigeneity, femicide, and ecocide, as well as writing that troubles existential borders of selfhood and authorship, of the notion of the independent and singular self-bounded border of identity. These questions animate her work in all 3 genres, and in that spirit, she's also the founder of the first Spanish-language PhD program in creative writing within the United States at the University of Houston. When Cristina first appeared on the show in 2019 to talk about 2 of her works of fiction recently translated into English, The Taiga Syndrome and The Iliac Crest, I remember that there was a wealth of nonfiction books by her that had yet to be translated. And it's truly remarkable what has happened in the 3 years since we talked, both in what has been carried across into English since and what she has written in Spanish during that time. To do justice to her accomplishments would require us to dispense with the interview entirely, so I will instead mention what has happened since we last talked. Since we last talked, she has published in English 3 books of nonfiction: the essay collection The Restless Dead, Necrowriting and Disappropriation, translated by Robin Myers; the scholarly work La Castañeda Insane Asylum, Narratives of Pain in Modern Mexico, translated by Laura Canost; and the hybrid work of essays, journalism, and poetry, Grieving, Dispatches from a Wounded Country, translated by Sarah Booker, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. Several books have also been published in Spanish. In 2020, she published Autobiografía de Algodón, Autobiography of Cotton, and in 2021, El Invencible Verano de Liliana, about her sister, the victim of a femicide 30 years ago, whose perpetrator was never brought to justice, winner of the Premio Iberoamericano de Letras José Donoso. And she has also published Lo Roto Precede a lo Entero, 125 infraensayos inspired by Georges Perec's posthumous book Infraordinario. As if that were not enough, she also became, or was finally recognized, as a genius, receiving the quote-unquote Genius Grant from the MacArthur Foundation in 2020. Cristina Rivera Garza returns to Between the Covers today to talk about her latest book in English, her new and selected stories from Dorothy Project, stories that span her career, showing how she has changed and transformed as a writer over time, including stories that have not yet been translated into Spanish. The stories that have been translated into English from Spanish were translated by Sarah Booker, as well as by Lisa Dillman, Francisca Gonzalez Arias, Alex Ross, and the author herself. Terry Hong for Self-Awareness says of Cristina's latest book, Rivera Garza's presentations invite continued interpretations and interrogations. Transparent understanding, definitive endings, convincing closure won't be found here. What Rivera Garza offers is invention, challenge, linguistic acrobatics, and more than occasional embrace of the impenetrable. Kirkus in its Star Review adds, the stories in this collection, tales from the most surreal of Shadowlands, are as varied as Rivera Garza's remarkable career, and this book is an excellent introduction to a unique writer who deserves to be recognized not just in Mexico, but all over the world. Finally, Publishers Weekly in its starred review says, this hypnotic, riveting collection of new and previously published stories from MacArthur Fellow Rivera Garza takes on love, migration, and violence. The author successfully deploys a range of styles and forms, influenced by prose poetry, fables, and postmodern experiments. Throughout, she documents the ravages of the real world while establishing a refuge in literature. These unsettling yet deeply approachable stories ought to earn Rivera Garza the wider attention she deserves. Welcome back to Between the Covers, Cristina Rivera Garza.
Hi, David. Thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be back here.
So I want to start with 3 meta questions about the arrival of the book before we get to the actual stories within the book. The first question I have is in the spirit of the introduction about your relationship to borders, particularly with regards to the notion of the individual or the individual bordered self, because it feels like you take a similar approach to the self as you do to the notion of a book as an object. Whereas I think most people see the publication of a book as the arrival of something in its final form, a form that has clear borders, meant to endure as such. It seems to me that every time one of your books comes out in translation, you see it as an opportunity to reimagine it, break it down, build it up again. For instance, your book Grieving is one you've characterized as mutating over time. Not only that it had different versions in Spanish, but that its arrival in English was not only an opportunity to add more, but to go back in and change what was already there. Your book La Castañeda, by contrast, started as a dissertation in English, and then you translated it into a less academic Spanish and published it like that, and then it gets translated back into English. And here again with new and selected stories, not only have you written stories for this collection which are appearing for the first time, and the first time they're appearing in English, you've also re-entered your Spanish language stories and revised some of them. You've even revised some of the translations, becoming a translator in a sense. So talk to us about this phenomenon for you of how it relates to your notion of the book as a book. And then maybe you can just talk a little bit also about the process of taking something apart that's already found its form and then creating a new form.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. This is a really good question. I think if I have been learning something about translation, and translation has become a central feature of all I do, is its capacity to unfinish, but what is apparently complete and finished. And so I've seen that as an opportunity, in fact. So as my works have been traveling from Spanish into English specifically, because they've been translated into languages that I'm not proficient on, and obviously I don't go through all these major work in languages like French or I don't know, Italian. But I'm very conscious about English to begin with, because I live in the United States. I've been in this country for such a long time, and I've developed a very close relationship with wonderful translators, with Sarah Booker, who's been a sidekick now in several major projects, with Robin Myers, who's also a poet, with recently with Sheila Samuelson, and you just mentioned the name of the translator of La Castañeda, Laura. So let me see. I believe that all work is work in progress. And that when we write the word "the end" at the end of these projects, it's fiction. It's just a way of pausing time, giving us some kind of respite, a time to rearrange things, to go over ideas. But certainly the fact that I've been having to go back to these texts, I would have never done this if I had remained only working in Spanish, of course. I had no reason to go back to reread my own work. That's something that I actually don't, I'm not actively looking forward, right? But the work of the translation has required such a intimate, detailed conversation with the translations as such, and has given me this opportunity of revising the work, of following threads that I had left just by themselves in previous attempts, right? So it's been, in fact, a rewriting process. I've been able to find new pathways in some of these texts. There were things that I didn't even remember when I went back the first time that I read some of these, especially the longer novels or the longer essays. And so, in that sense, I think it's actually a privilege. When I was living in Mexico and I started to publish some of my books in Mexico, I always harbored this idea. I wanted to change the titles, for example, of my books, and I actually ran this idea by my editors in Mexico, and they said, we don't think that might work because people attach, meanings to these titles. Then I was thinking, the books change over time. I mean, that's the issue. They are apparently done. They have acquired a specific and stable identity, apparently only. And every time that these books go through borders, face new readerships, new audiences, they are able, if we're lucky, they are able to say new things. And so as I start working with my translators, we've been very aware of these traveling, of this going back to the places where many of these works were first conceived. So it's been a very strange translation, retro-translation, untranslation in a way. And I take that to be a creative process as well. So I am creating with the collaboration, very intimate collaboration of the translations, new works. And in that sense, I'm also very aware of the fact that this is a collaborative effort, that what appeared in Spanish some years ago, 10, 20 years ago, is one book. And what we're creating right now, with surrounded by English, thinking about an English-speaking audience as well, it's a new book, and it's a new collaborative work. All writing, to me, in my view, is collaborative work. It's work made in a plural, and in that sense, it's very hard for me to conceive that border, that isolated self that you mentioned at the beginning. And I think translation it just makes that process so visible. The fact that we're always in dialogue with others when we're writing.
Well, my second meta question is around something that you say in the introduction, which is that the process of revisiting and revising these old stories, which you've already intimated it was an uncomfortable journey. And I couldn't help but notice that only 2 stories from your first story collection are in the selected, and only 3 from your second collection are included here, which made me curious about your encounter with your earliest writer self, what you discovered about those earliest stories, especially, I guess, about maybe the ones that aren't there. But I know a lot of the listeners are writers or art makers. And I'm sure people would be interested in hearing what things you saw in your own early writing that you now feel differently about or wouldn't do, or what things you learned about yourself by looking at that early work. If I'm maybe even reading too much into that, but also maybe the continuities you were surprised to discover from your first stories to now, or even just what was uncomfortable about that journey of re-entering work that spans 30 years.
It was certainly an uncomfortable experience. These are many years and many years of continuous work too. There were, as you said, some continuities, and I was not entirely surprised by them. And there were issues that I now recognize as approaches that in my present view were failing, but that I see also as learning processes, as always is the case, right? So there is a very deep concern about issues dealing with bodies and genders, and with danger, with a sense of seething violence that is not necessarily visible or identifiable, but somewhat permeating the whole scene, the interactions among characters. So it seems to me that even though when I began writing, we were not explicitly talking about, for example, the so-called war on drugs, or what we now know as the war on women, I was in a way paying attention to zines that were enigmatic enough, hard to understand, hard to explain, or that I was struggling not to normalize them, right? So there is this intention. I can recognize now, looking from the present into the past, that intention of collecting these different scenes that somehow made the world a menacing place, a place that I was not able to normalize, to fully understand, and that therefore I had to pay attention, to very close attention, which to me is a good definition of what writing does, right? It helps us to pay very close attention to issues specifically, at least in my case, that I don't fully comprehend, and that therefore remain, they come back again and again, nagging me, asking me for some sort of, if not understanding, at least approach, some sort of connection, right? And I was a voracious reader when I was young, as I guess most all writers are. I was playing with form. I was, in a way, dancing, right? Trying to find the specific tempo and tone and pitch and sound for all these stories that I wanted to share. The first book is very realist in my approach to the storytelling, even though there are moments in which what we might term as the fantastic takes place within the story. These were very gritty city-based stories, mostly related to Mexico City in the late 20th century. And I think that the evolution that at least became clearer in my mind when I was reading all these materials is this slow but this way of exploring form, different types of genres. And specifically, I was very seduced by the opportunities of the detective story on the one hand, of the possibilities of the fantastic as such. And I see that becoming more and more prominent as the stories reach our present. So the concerns, I think, are more or less stable. Bodies are always there. What do we do with our bodies? How do we relate to each other? How gender and class and race play a role in complicating those relationships? And what do we do, or what do I do as a writer in order to remain on my toes, to be alert at how danger is lurking through these relationships, not only between humans, but also between humans and non-humans, characters in these stories. I think that's something that has been there as a constant concern throughout the stories. And of course, I mean, I was a young writer when I recently this year we released a new version in Spanish, a new version of my first short story collection. It was the original title was La Guerra No Importa, War Doesn't Matter, and now we released it last year with a new title. Now finally, my dream about changing titles came through, and it's now called Andamos Perras, Andamos Diablas. We go like she devils, we low like bitches, which I thought was more in tune with not only the stories but also the moment that we're living right now. And something that I mentioned there in the preface that I wrote is that I can see that very young writer dealing the best she could with issues of form and content, and that dance between the two, and trying to find each other and create something that is shareable. And I see the writer failing quite often, and failing big and failing again. But the good thing is that that writer is trying and is trying again and again. So there is this curiosity, there is alertness about form and what form can do. But on the other hand, and I was very uncomfortable. Right. I mean, because I was revising the pieces, but I didn't want to polish them unnecessarily. I mean, I wanted them to keep that writtenness. It was a first book, and I wanted it to remain a first book. So I didn't want to interfere. I didn't want to invade the book. I just wanted to reread it, to make it more approachable, but I didn't want to drastically transform them. I didn't want that book to be the book of the writer that I am now. I wanted it was important for me at that point that something that I saw in that very young writer, that there was an energy that I now envy, a way of just there is this, I don't know how, it's vigor. There is this like someone who is not actually paying much attention about decorum and how things should be done, and it's someone just who is exploring and doing that as freely as we can at times. So I was not that aware as I have become over the years about the state of a literary moment and the rules of our trade and the issues of convention, all like those kinds of things that I like to interrogate, and I try to do very consciously now. I think I was when I was reading this early work, what I see someone doing it with great energy and with no respect at all. I mean, I don't know if that is a word that I'm looking for.
I like that juxtaposition of the things that you are uncomfortable with, but also the things that you envy?
Yeah, I think we only write a first book. We write a first book only once, and that's such a privilege. It's a state of grace in many sense. So there are no expectations for us, from readers, but even I myself had no expectations. There was this need, and it was a wild, forceful need to be there, to have these comings and goings with language. And there was an experience that needed to be put into words in that specific way. And so that is strength, and that's something that I look back at and I say, well, yeah, I want that back. I want more of that in my own work even now. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you my third and last meta question, which is about fiction and versus nonfiction. Because when we talked in 2019, even though your novels, The Iliac Crest and Taiga Syndrome, had both just come out in English, for the most part, you had been focusing on nonfiction in your own writing for many years. So you were revisiting at that point work that you had written a while ago in Spanish. And you alluded to a dissatisfaction with fiction for you as an adequate vehicle for what you were aspiring toward when we talked. And since 2019, both the books you've written in Spanish and the ones that have arrived in English have overwhelmingly been nonfiction too. So it's perhaps improbable that we find ourselves again talking about your fiction, given how much of your work is nonfiction. But I wondered if you could speak to your relationship to fiction now, 3 years later, both generally speaking, but also with regards to two rare nods to fiction in the last couple of years for you. For instance, you've referred to your ostensibly non-fictional book, Autobiography of Cotton, as a novel, and you've also written new fictions for this, New and Selected. So tell us where you're at about the limitations or the opportunities of fiction for you and where you stand today in relationship to the imagined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I've developed a complicated relationship with fiction over the years, and it's a love-hate relationship. I taught an intro to fiction for many years at UCSD, and I remember I used to tell my students on our first class, I used to ask them, why should we study fiction? And they all thought that it was a rhetorical question, the kind of question that a professor would pose to the class, looking for support for fiction as such. And so I was always taken aback when they were just so smart and they offer all these possibilities. And at one point I was like, yeah, they must be right. There might be something that fiction does in that sense. The usual, the empathy, the possibility of fiction to create empathy, to put oneself on someone else's shoes, the imagination, etc. But I have to be honest about I quoted what a Norwegian author, Nausgaard, has said about fiction as lacking any kind of power in a world in which pretty much everything is fiction. I think he said it quite right. Right there, that's my major qualm about fiction right now. So what can fiction do in a world in which pretty much everything is fiction, right? Is there any power in the sense of providing us with critical tools to look into the world and with critical tools to change our lives, right? So I started to move away from fiction, and I was at a certain point during the early 21st century. I was thinking very hard about issues of appropriation and issues of research related to the writing of fiction. I, as many others, was interrogating the role of the author and the kind of license that fiction authors often give themselves in order to deal with issues that require much ethical and aesthetic care, right? So all that became a matter of much thought and concern, and therefore my relationship with fiction became, as I said, complicated. But I have to admit that even in works, my three last books that have yet to be translated into English, Había mucha neblina o humo no sé qué, which is essentially my relationship with a major Mexican author, Juan Rulfo, and in a chronicle, a range of chronicles about my following of his steps in some Mexican territories. And then what you mentioned, the autobiography of Cotton, which is an exploration of the migrant experience of my maternal and paternal grandparents too. So, and obviously the most recent, the Liliana's Invincible Summer, which will be out by Hogarth Press in 2023. But the three books shared certain method or methodology, if you want to call it that way. It's an emphasis on research as a mode of care, as a way of caring for the materials and the topics that I'm trying to explore or become close to. And the point here was that even though I was paying attention to the different modes of nonfiction, in order to tell these stories, I had to rely on fiction. So I call Autobiography of Cotton a novel because even though it's written in different genres, I thought that the genre that became the host of all of them was in fact fiction. So in order to fill out the gaps, in order to create the linkage that goes from beginning till end of the book, that is something that fiction, the embrace, the total embrace of the book is something that fiction allowed. Whereas in El Invencible Verano de Liliana, or in the previous book, I think nonfiction played that role. So it's a matter of degree, I suppose. I'm not in an either or position right now. I am less belligerent than I was some 5 years ago with fiction. I found myself not too long ago, at the end of last year, writing. I wrote a lot of pages of something that might become a speculative novel, and it's totally fiction. And I was absolutely startled by going back to a genre that allows much freedom, but that also obviously has very strict rules. So I'm experimenting. I don't think that I can unfiction myself. I don't think I'm going to go back to fiction as I used to practice fiction. I think it's going to be a different take, and it's going to be informed by all these questions and interrogations that I've been posing to my own work and my readings. But there is something, of course, there that is very mercurial and full of possibility as well. And I'm again intrigued by that possibility.
Well, in the intro to your book, La Castañeda, about the narratives of pain in a insane asylum in Mexico, you say that we are in the presence of a conjoined twin brother, separated at birth from its opposite twin sister, that your novel Nadie me verá llorar and this non-fictional book where we're reading the introduction are conjoined twins, and that whether or not they recognize one another, they both need each other. And that is one thing that I really love about your work. It's the porousness between all of it, the ways the questions and the themes in your fiction, your nonfiction, and your poetry, they all seem to immigrate or emigrate from one to the next, perhaps even inviting the reader to find connections or make connections. And in that spirit, I wanted to propose a connection and see how it feels to you. Many of your fictional protagonists in your stories and novels are meaning makers, detectives, journalists, translators, ethnographers, and they by nature are seeking to construct meaning, to uncover a truth, to put things into language, but it feels like that the world of your stories often is working against the success of this. In the Taiga syndrome, so much of the vital communication is mediated through a translator into a language that is nobody's first language. In the Iliac Crest, there's an invented language of the two women guests that excludes the host from understanding. And in Your New and Selected, we see that too, the breakdown of language, miscommunication or fragmented communication. And in speaking about your debut 1991 collection, La Guerra No Importa, you say the term unknowing, which is also the name of one of the stories in it, is the best term to describe the intimate operation at the heart of the stories of your first book. And also that unknowing was what you thought writing was for. And when I'm thinking of all of this, and I'm returning to this notion of conjoined twins across genres, I listened to a recent talk you gave. You were talking about writing your book, El Invencible Verano de Liliana, about the murder of your sister. And you read for the audience one paragraph that you must have translated into English, a very linear and straightforward and factual paragraph about the situation of her death. And then you said that that paragraph took you 30 years to be able to write, and that you had been struck speechless up until then. And when you said that, I thought back to what I mentioned about all these meaning-making characters in your stories that are confronted with the failure of being able to make meaning. And I wondered if you felt a connection between your speechlessness and the way these stories are constructed with these characters that have a certain vocation that is being sabotaged in a sense by the world in which they're operating.
This is just great. Thank you so much for that reading and for making those connections. I think you have summarized some of the operations central to most of my work. Definitely, there is these meaning makers are in a way like linguistic shifters, right? They are continuously moving, transforming themselves and adapting or opposing circumstances that are apparently beyond their control. And that tension is central to the story as such. It's the reason why the story exists. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. I'm reminded of what Ricardo Piglia said in that little book, Formas Breves. Without paradox, we don't have a story. There is no need to tell a story without paradox, right? So that contradiction at the heart of human experience, in a way, is what is propelling the storytelling as such. And I think in my case, there are two issues equally relevant. On the one hand, the speechlessness or the frozen states to which violence forces very often. Adriana Cabarero said, and I think in a very convincing way, that the task of horror precisely is to freeze us, to paralyze us, to prevent us from having any kind of reaction, and which is what power wants, obviously. And in a way, I see writing as a possibility of going through that stage and finally put that experience, which could be the experience of trauma, in words, identifying and containing the shapelessness that is violence in it at its core, right? And so that tension is fundamental. At the same time, on the other extreme, but very closely linked, I think, is the issue of the naturalization of violence. Is on the one hand, lack of language, and on the other hand, the surplus of language. You know, the way in which many of these hierarchies are accepted as such without questioning them, or violence as such as just another component of everyday life. So I think writing or these meaning makers, these characters that are continuously trying to if not capturing, at least to go through this experience, to approach them in a way that are not overwhelming. I think these meaning makers, that's what they are trying to do. Vis-a-vis the shapelessness that is violence, or the fossilization at the same time, this petrous nature of violence, both of them are on these extremes of experience. And I do believe that writing is a way of going through them. Not necessarily in order to solve a puzzle, or to fix a problem, but just to make the approach bearable. I suppose that's as far as I would like to get in that kind of as an explanation of my own experience as a writer, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the reason why the four of the issues that you mentioned are so important. The presence of mediation in all these stories. We have to know as readers how knowledge is being built, and what are the different stages that language has to go through in order for us to be able to receive that. And so the story is about that. So regardless of the topic, regardless of the plot, the story is about how we get to even approach that experience that always belongs to other, right? And so no first languages, all languages are invented languages in a way, comes as a result, language comes as a result of the specific conversations. I've been working a lot with literal meaning. There is a short story. I don't think that one made it into this book, about a woman that gave her hand metaphorically, as in marriage, but the man was asking for her hand literally, as in maiming. And so looking for those ways in which literal meaning emphasizes something that is dangerous and lurking our relationships, I think is being important as well. And when I say that unknowing is relevant, is precisely because what we are usually facing is either that utter lack of language or that excess of language, and just opening new paths through that experience, and looking at the world anew, just unknowing what we've been trained to look at and to perceive. I think that's something that has been very glorious, in fact, as a reader for me. So that's what literature has given me as a reader, and I would love to think that some of that might be what readers find also in my books, if I'm lucky.
It's interesting to hear you speak about unknowing being important still, because the way you phrased it in the intro was that for your first book, unknowing was what you thought writing was for, which seemed to me to have a subtext that maybe that wasn't what writing was for you anymore. But in your essays in Grieving, when speaking about mourning, you say that by losing the other, you not only mourn the loss, but become inscrutable to yourself. And that vulnerability and unknowing are the foundations from which to rethink a theory of collective power and responsibility. So I do see you in your nonfiction weaving unknowing into almost into a political theory or a political position.
That's important to me, definitely. I think interrogating what we understand or what we don't understand about our world is precisely what I'm trying to do when dealing with language. So posing a question that is strong enough or at least enigmatic enough to attract someone else's attention, I think that's something that we do together, and as such might gain relevance for our daily life. And again, I'm referring to also to my own experience as a young reader, as a voracious reader, always as someone whose life has been transformed many ways by what I get the chance to approach through books and through language. So specifically in the case of grieving of this book, I think I was trying to just to think through a very complicated, the most violent years in recent Mexican history. I was trying to make sense together with others about what was our daily life like? What could we do? The experience of pain was so widespread, and the lack of language, the power of horror was very much established in our midst. So interrogating language and trying to think through those interrogations, I think that's what kept me, at least, not only alive but willing to continue probing in what was our reality like. What could we do together? So there is. I've been reading recently the works by Cristina Sharp in the Waking of Blackness and Being, and
I love that book.
Yeah, it's a marvelous book, and that relationship that she makes between wake, the different levels, the meanings of the word, also related to grieving, to el duelo, no, in Spanish, and the way in which pain allows us to bring back with great force the sources of misfortune and tragedy, and therefore gives us the critical capacity to confront anew a situation, but always with this within the solidarities built with others, that embrace. I think that's so relevant, and I'm continuously thinking about how grieving allows us to do that, and forces us, at least myself, to connect. We cannot grieve in singular, as I said in the book. We do these. This is like writing something that we do in plural.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up a couple times horror. I really like your exploration of what you call horrorism in grieving, where you contrast terror, which is something one experiences with fear and attempts to escape, versus horror, which goes beyond fear, which renders one speechless, immobile, without agency, mouth hanging open, and something that you call the extreme spectacle of power. And your book, Grieving, opens with two tortured bodies hanging from a bridge. And all of that made me, with regards to questions of language, the question of horrorism related to speech made me think of my conversation with the Palestinian writer Adania Shibli. And she talks about the inarticulate or stuttering speech of her character under occupation, a character who doesn't have a sophisticated political analysis of her own situation, where she's often blaming herself for her inability to orient herself or navigate well what is otherwise a seamless, smooth, articulate narrative of the state, that is a narrative that has erased her previous reality. When you ask in Grieving, what can we do in the face of horrorism when speechlessness and social paralysis prevail? I wonder if this question is one that you feel animates your short stories as well.
Yeah, just as you mentioned earlier, the relationship between Nadie me verá llorar, No One Will See Me Cry, and La Castañeda, the more academic book, as twin sister and brother. I think Grieving is being a twin for several, twin brother and sister at the same time, a twin person for the short stories. I think I work like that. I work in following at least two different paths. One of them, I'm trying to create arguments. I'm trying to write in a mode that allows me to approach specific, very concrete, contextual situations that I'm going through. But at the same time, I'm looking for these other aspects that are more related to form, that pathway of an exploration, a more conscious exploration of form, I would say, and the elements of fiction, character, and dialogues, and all that, plot, our narrative arcs, and all that kind of thing, right? But I think there are layers of the same question, of the same kind of curiosity, or the same impulse for survival. As the stories become more and more fantastic, as I explore more issues in the genre of the fantastic, I think the essays become more clearly connected to issues that deal with agency and politics. And so it is like the two sides of the same coin, with trying to go through those experiences with different tools, and arriving certainly to different points, to different places.
Well, I want to take these questions into how you portray selfhood and identity of your characters in your new and selected. You often have said that we never write alone, and I think you even said it here today, that we're always writing with others, that we're indebted to others. You've also said that your work with your translator, Sarah Booker, has affected and changed the way that you write when you're quote unquote alone now. And you've also said today and elsewhere that similarly, it's impossible to grieve in the first person singular, that we're always grieving for someone and with someone, and that grieving connects us in ways that are subtly and candidly material. So thinking of this, I wonder about the question of naming in your fiction, the number of characters who assume names that are mistakenly given to them, who are wrongly named, who are nameless, or are simply called names like stranger.
Mm-hmm.
One woman who calls herself Xian after she's mistakenly called this in one story. In another story, this woman who's assumed a mistaken name as her own gives a false name to another woman, saying that truth is not what is important, complicity is. But I wonder about these names and also about namelessness, things that seem to do more concealing than revealing, and whether they somehow relate to your notions around writing and grieving as being collective. If somehow these are ways to destabilize the notion of a delimited border of the individual. If when you say in grieving, quote, in the beginning there was the we being the most intimate and also most political form of accessing one's subjectivity, if perhaps the failed naming is part of this subjective we, or maybe all of these curiosities or ways in which you're engaging with naming is about something entirely else. But I would love to hear about this repeated desire of you to destabilize the names of the characters.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time thinking about names and thinking about pronouns, and all of them have to do with the linguistic elements that we use to delineate identity, right? And since I refuse to, I'm always very suspicious of stable ideas or self-contained ideas of identity. I think my handling of names and my handling of pronouns, specifically in all these stories, has to be problematic. So it is a major issue. It is not a minor issue, I want to say. So yes, indeed. We've been named so often. We are given names. We are given ways of knowing ourselves. We are given specific prescribed access to ourselves. That's what power does in many ways. So renaming, finding alternative names, names that are grown out of complicity instead of I don't know, hierarchy, right? Or hierarchy making structures. I think I think about that when I'm naming my characters, and I realized one of the things that I realized as I was going back to these early stories is that something that I've been doing for a long time. So I thought that it was some recent concern of mine as a result of some theoretical readings, but I realized that it was right there at the very beginning. I would say that that's one of the instigators of writing, just to think of why is someone naming me? Why should I respond to these characteristics? Woman, young, Mexican, whatever. Why am I giving all these ways of knowing myself? And if I want to explore life in a critical way, I should start by the name. And so, yes, in those early stories, women are usually referred to in the wrong name, but then they appropriate that wrongness. They make that wrongness their own, and therefore they are transforming the way in which they are seen. They see themselves, and they act upon the world as well. And the same goes for the pronouns. I've been moving carefully, from the he and she and the we and the they now, because all of them bring promise and bring danger as well. So I try to be very careful about my handling of these elements in the story. I spend much of my time, especially when dealing with short stories, about this is what these short stories are for. I think these are the scope of the short story allows me to deal with these issues that it could be very complicated to do that in a novel, in a longer work, in any case, without changing the story and without really having to start anew and all those things, right? But in the more restricted context of the short story, I think that's what I do, just to go through those specific questions. And one of them is definitely the power of naming, the power of new names, of names that we give to ourselves and to others, the names that we appropriate and we make our own as we continue living, and the pronouns that we use in order to become actors in our stories. Mm-hmm.
Many of my favorite stories in this selected are those in your third collection, La Frontera Más Distante, which often engage with questions through an anthropologic or ethnographic lens, while also interrogating that lens, I think. I'd love to spend some time with the story called Autoethnography of the Other. It's narrated by an anthropologist or ethnographer and starts with the lines, "The man never revealed his name. Perhaps he didn't know it, or perhaps he had decided to hide it." And later we learn that this studied man calls himself you, and calls our narrator anthropologist I, and that the anthropologist has, in secret, hiding this from her colleagues, taken the studied man into her house and broken all the professional rules of propriety and objectivity. But the result of her well-meaningness is disastrous ultimately. And I was hoping you could speak to this story and its animating questions for us.
Many of the stories of this collection are, to my mind, pieces of speculative fiction, even though they are not placed in specifically in the future. They make references, oblique references in any case, to a time that is not quite here yet. And so they move, I think, freely from the very origins of humanity to a future that might be 100 or 200 years away from us right now. So in this story, as in other stories in this collection, there are societies inhabited by women only, and this is one of them. And I've been, at that point, I was spending some time thinking about what would happen, what would that entail, what kind of power relationships would come out as a result of these connections of bodies and desire and futures, fugitivity as well, right? So I've used in this story, I used a very basic lineal history of anthropology. I, in fact, was attending a workshop by anthropologist Ruth Behar at that point, and I was thinking, wow, this is just so interesting. These different stages that might allow us to have a sense of what anthropology has done in recent times, but at the same time, that's what I thought. This is going to help me to be able to trace the different stages in a relationship. And in that case, it was an heterosexual relationship within a context of an all women society, and the kind of challenges that relationship posed to the new hierarchies, and the kind of menace that these, which is now the normative hegemonic type of relationship, what would happen if we could invert those conditions, right? So that was the question for me, and as usual, that got connected to issues of language and knowing, and how this person, this man, this nameless man, this stranger, el extraño, el salvaje, the person who is not, they were not going to be able to capture, what kind of discomfort and what kind of disorder it is going to bring into this society. So that's mostly the question, and obviously the result is not going to be pleasant and at the end of the story, but I shouldn't talk about that.
I'm tempted to talk about it, because I guess I would say that the traumatic moment comes around this studied man being brought to the movies and seeing representation of self separate from self. This question of this way he names himself you, versus I. Seeing the film is something that really is a fall from Eden in a way for him, I think. And you have this refrain in the book: taxidermic ethnography expresses the desire of some scholars to make what is dead seem alive. Cinema, colonialism, and anthropology were born at the same time. We get this line many times. And I just wondered if you could talk about it a little bit, about the significance of these three things coming or emerging together for you and the story.
Yeah, and there are two moments, I think, in the story that are the dramatic note right here. One has to do with representation and the danger of representation, what it does to us. And I think that's very much related to what I was mentioning earlier about naming, with the names that we're given or imposed upon us. And that's the weight of representation. And I think that fall from Eden that you're referring to when the character looks at the movies, that's precisely it. So whereas they've been living, these two characters, they've been living away from the knowledge of others, kind of in a using the small apartment as a hideout. Once they are out, once they have to become something knowable, something to be known out there, the situation drastically changes. And the other moment, I think, is when in order for him to go out, he dresses as a woman. He uses lipstick, right? So he has to undergo that gender transformation as well. So those two elements become this, as I said, the dramatic knot of the story, and they both have to do with the weight of representation, the jail, the prison that representation very often allows and invites, in fact. And that's one of my problems with identity. So one that is imposed upon you, there is very little room to wiggle, right? There is very little room to experiment and to be able to host your many mutations and possibilities and potency, right? And so in emphasizing specifically that danger, that weight of representation through cinema or through naming, I think the writing is trying to bring out this critically, at least by opposition in any case, these other possibilities.
Well, one real person that gets mentioned in the story as you go through the different eras of anthropology is Ishi, the so-called last Yahi Indian, who at the turn of the century, when his tribe had been decimated, he lived in the Anthropology Museum of the University of California, San Francisco. He was employed there as a janitor, but he also entertained guests as a living museum installation and participated in the recording of Yahi myths and songs, which became part of an early ethnographic film. And shortly after describing this, we get the line, taxidermic ethnography expresses the desire of some scholars to make what is dead seem alive. One of the main anthropologists involved at that time, who I think you might mention by name, but you don't go into it, is Alfred Kroeber. And I bring this up because he's Ursula Le Guin's father. And he's also one of the most well-known anthropologists at the time of the birth of this field as an academic discipline. And for a totally different conversation for the show, I was watching a lecture of Fred Moten called Transubstantiation and Co-Substantiality, that looks at the work of an anthropologist that he really admires, contemporary anthropologist, Elizabeth Pavanelli, who works with Aboriginal Australians. She has a book called Economies of Abandonment, and that book uses Le Guin's story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and Charles Burnett's canonical work of avant-garde filmmaking, The Killer of Sheep, as frames to address questions of late liberalism within the Aboriginal community, where Le Guin's story, which is about a utopian society where everyone's good life is substantively good in all the tangible ways of well-being, but that real and tangible well-being depends upon the continued suffering of a child in a broom closet. I don't want to read too much into the fact that she chose a broom closet rather than a dungeon or a basement, but it's interesting to me that Ishi worked as a janitor and that this child is in a broom closet. But what Pavanelli finds powerful in Le Guin's story as a critique of late liberalism is that she makes the body of this child co-substantial with that of the community. There's no way to free the child without diminishing the benefits one has of good health, secure living, etc. That any solution other than enjoying your goodness and coming to terms with the fact that it comes from the ongoing suffering of another, the only other solution would be to acknowledge the child's suffering as your own suffering and to take some of that on to lessen it for her. I don't know if this is a question, but I think about this with regards to that story and several of the other stories in this collection within your selected. And I just wondered if you had any further thoughts about this question of co-substantiality, which feels connected to me to you searching for a subjective we, perhaps.
It's a very complex question, and you put it beautifully right there. I'm reminded, for example, in Nadie me verá llorar, no one will see me cry. The main character, which is based on the file of an actual inmate. That's the wording of the time, a patient, we would say now, an inmate of the insane asylum in early 20th century Mexico. One of the issues that was very prominent in the file was how tired she was of being seen. And it was not said in this specific way, but that's something that I gathered from reading the documents. And when I was reading the story of Ishi, and that was kind of like the subtext of this of the whole story of the whole ethnography with other. I kept that in mind. The issue of the museum, the issue of the gaze that is being imposed upon certain ways of structuring and representing again the world, and what real life brings to bear, right? The activity of this person working as a janitor right there in the same place. So bringing all those things together in a way that might allow some questioning, right? Some alternative, some other possibility. I think that's what I see myself doing. And in order to do that, this whole notion of who is doing what to whom, is absolutely central. We don't know exactly, because of all these many mediations that take place in the way in which we approach the world and live through that. And specifically for us as readers, right? Getting to walk into a story as such. So what I can say, David, about that is that is what occupies my mind. That's what I'm trying to go through. And I'm doing it in this multi-layered way, looking at stories that are out there, that are known, that are even famous, that are somehow canonical in many ways. And they could be the stories like Ishi, or they could be novels and entire works like Amparo Dávila's in the Iliad Crest. There is always this interconnection and this inner structural dialogue within which the story as such develops. And the reason why, in fact, let's say the story comes into being in the first place. And I haven't used the word co-substantiality, but I've read Povinelli with great attention. I think what she has to say about the different dramas, as she calls that, in geontologies. That's something that has been very much in my mind in my more recent work. I've been working with this specific book, the geontologist book, in my classes, and has allowed me to reread entire works by Mexican authors in relation to the desert. And my own experience writing autobiography of Cotton was very much permeated by her ideas.
I want to return to co-substantiality eventually in regards to the ecological themes in your work.
Yeah.
But maybe depart from it for now, or take a long route back to it and return to some fiction specific questions, particularly short story form questions. Because you speak about something that's intriguing in your introduction. You've mentioned already Ricardo Piglia, and you quote him. Doubleness is very important for him as a writer. He's had an alter ego since he was a teenager that goes through his entire work, Emilio Renzi. So his own autobiography is the fictional diaries of Emilio Renzi. But Piglia says in your introduction, a short story always tells two stories. A visible story hides a secret tale. And you add, the short story is the name we have chosen to describe the production of the cultural and social space in which something hidden becomes visible and therefore shared, but still is a secret. And you go farther to say Piglia's statement helped you revise and rearrange the stories. But tell us about the notion of a story always telling two stories. Why that's important, why you would choose to open your introduction of your body of work to date in fiction, in short fiction, with this quote of Piglia's.
It was important to me to connect back to some Latin American tradition first. And I admire Piglia's work, but I could have used some other authors as well. I mean, from U.S. writers or European traditions, but I intently wanted to make that connection. The notion of the two stories, of the subterranean story and the story that we are actually writing, to me is relevant because it pays attention to the issue of form, and calls attention as well to the secret that we share. So there is this other Argentinian author whose name, of course, is going to escape me right now, Eduardo Gruner, that's his name. In this book, El fin de las pequeñas historias, the end of the little histories, of small histories, he speaks there about poetry as a way in which we found to share something without actually capturing it, right? To share an experience as a secret and as an enigma. That to me is central in the making of the short story. That there is a connection that I'm trying to create with readers, but that is not based on explicitness and in a resolution, but rather in the possibility of sharing a moment of disorientation, a moment of perhaps a failed meaning making, as we were speaking earlier. But the fact that we've gone through that together, that's what makes the story to me valuable. The fact of convoking that energy and that potentiality, that's what's relevant. And I think Piglia does a good job of, in a very efficient way, of pointing that specific strength of the short story. Although I'd say, to be honest, I think that that's not only something that is intrinsic to short stories. I would say that that's something that writing in general, if lucky, can do.
Well, it might be a stretch to connect these two things, but when I'm thinking about this notion about a story always telling two stories, or perhaps writing always telling two stories, I also think about some of the ideas you explore in The Restless Dead, necrowriting and disappropriation. So I was just listening to the poet Alice Oswald's latest Oxford lecture. It's called Lament for the Earth. And she relates a conversation she had with an old folk singer who said that the old man who taught him to sing said that when you sing a song correctly with your ear to tradition, then the dead will show up and sing with you. And I think of your quoting of John Berger in The Restless Dead also. The quote goes, "To see the dead as the individuals they once were tends to obscure their nature. Try to consider the living as we might assume the dead to do, collectively. The living reduce the dead to those who have lived, yet the dead already include the living in their own great collective." This is so chillingly brilliant to me, and also makes me think of Juan Rulfo, who you engage with in this collection and elsewhere. And your notion, which you actually spoke about on a Juan Rulfo panel that couldn't be called a Juan Rulfo panel because his family had trademarked his name. But in this panel, secretly about him, that your work doesn't go back into the past, but pulls the past forward into the lived contemporary moment. So in a way, making the present a haunted space, or a haunted dream space. But I wondered if you see a connection, say, between this notion of the double story, Piglia's notion of the double story, the visible and the secret one, and this other notion of necrowriting?
There is definitely a connection there. I've been working more recently with very closely with the notion of sediment and the sedimentation as a mode of writing as such. Of course, this is very much connected to basic teachings of geology. The present always containing the past, and the task of the geologist, kind of like lifting these different sediments of experience until you find, with this notion, of course, of big time. So these three elements have played a major role in my most recent work. And in order to do so, I think it would be very difficult to do so if I didn't have a layered notion of the story, of the short story, and writing in general as this two-story combo or two-story operation. So in many ways, that which is without words or that which is with many words, the two extremes that we were talking about at the beginning, conform this haunted present. And my task as a writer, if I want to go through that, is precisely that the critical operation linked to the desedimentation. So in a way, is that I'm talking about the experience, the lived experience on the one hand, but also the writing experience as a material element, as a material practice as such. And so two of them, I think, collide, that they're converged, that they're, and all of that has to do with our death, the death that are with us, not in a metaphorical way, but in a very material way, convoking us, invoking us, inviting us to be aware of their presence, which is to be aware of these many sediments that are encompassed in our present time. To be fully present is to be fully in that deep time, and I think writing has some of the tools that we use when we write are showing us the way. It's a way of really intersecting, articulating that possibility.
One thing I was really taken by in your book, The Restless Dead, was the notion of disappropriation. And then when you're speaking now about the tools of writing, you go into detail around writing practices. Speaking of horrorism, you say that when horrorism leads not just to speechlessness and social paralysis, but ultimately to a place where resistance and struggle are suffocated as soon as they emerge, that certain community-based writing practices become that much more relevant and vital. And you name them, and I really love this part. Writing practices that don't hide their debt to others. And being more specific, you speak of the importance of processes that question the legitimacy and or political usefulness of notions of authorship that don't involve community connections. The importance of processes that emphasize the material conditions of production that either allow writing to exist or don't allow writing to exist in the first place. And processes that underline the roles not only of authors, but of readers and their communities in the production and sharing of writing materials. You say these practices, these writing practices, usher in the disappropriation of materials, with the goal being of returning all writing to its plural origin. I was hoping you could speak more into this notion of disappropriation, something that you've also called a poetics that challenges the concept and practice of property and challenges the concept and practice of propriety. Tell us if this plays a role in your fiction, but even if it doesn't, I think writers would love to hear about disappropriation of materials.
This was part of a very charged and larger conversation that was taking place in the United States during the early 21st century. and that as I was moving back and forth between Oaxaca and California, it's a conversation that I was developing in Oaxaca with concerns that somehow became very vivid as I became part of a writing community in Southern California. So it's a transnational type of interaction and a shared concern about who has the right to write, who has the right to write stories, right? And what do we do with materials that are never our own? That passage that goes from experience into language, from so-called real life into the story that we're trying to tell, that passage is full of ethical concerns. And so the disappropriation part of this conversation had to do precisely with addressing those ethical concerns. If we as a writer, if we as writers are continuously writing the story of others, and that's what we do, and I'm convinced that that's what we do, even we write the most intimate side of ourselves. Once we touch language, we are in connection with others, and so to be a writer to my mind is not to write stories or to publish stories, is to actually contest and interrogate that transition, that mediation that goes from experience into language. So some of the answers, part of that conversation, a very charged and a very important conversation that I was part of at that time, was very much, I thought, entertained within the limits of identity, right? So you approach certain stories because your identity was this or that. But that came, that was very problematic for someone who has been thinking about the weight of representation, right? About the imposition created by names and specific hierarchies and narratives in that sense. So I had to move away from the straitjacket, so to speak, of identity and find some other ways to address those ethical concerns from a slightly different angle. And so as a result of these many conversations, I think this concept of disappropriation, I started to use it more and more, and it grew very slowly, right? So on the one hand, it was important not to appropriate the stories of others, the value of others, the work of others, right? But to disappropriate that in a way as a code word to say, to make that visible, to make that even palpable, that I wanted my work to be able to show that what I was doing was not the result of some individuality, the self-contained individuality, but part of a larger dialogue that transversed me, that went through me, but that didn't define me at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I think central to that notion is what I was saying earlier, the whole notion, the whole practice of research. So we don't know things. We are not. These stories are not intrinsic to what we are. Earlier, you mentioned that I spoke of that very objective paragraph describing my latest book about my sister's femicide, and that it had taken me 30 years to write such a seemingly smooth paragraph, right? Well, those 30 years, I think, have been years of research understood in the most ample, most flexible of senses, right? And the same goes for autobiography of Cotton. I can't summarize the plot right now, and I can tell you it's a story. I'm exploring the migrant experiences of my paternal grandparents who walked all the way from San Luis Potosí, from indigenous communities into the mining communities, coal mining communities of the north, to finally settle themselves in the cotton fields along the Mexico-US border. And said in that way, it would seem that that's a story that I grew up with, that is somehow intrinsic to my sense of being. which is not the case, right? So in order to write that book and to write about the migrant story also of my maternal grandparents who lived all their lives in the United States and were expelled in the 1930s, right after the crash of 1929, right? Finding, going back to a country that they hardly knew, and finally establishing themselves also on those cotton fields along the Tamaulipas, Texas borders. It could seem that I knew the story all along. And again, that's not the case. So research is what allowed me to get close to those materials up to a certain point. So I did the archival research. I went to these places. I did field research. I interviewed people. I tried very seriously to be as close as I could to all these materials. And then after all that work is done, then I have those 300 pages in this book. And I can say, this is a story of my grandparents. And this is a story told in such a way that fiction is the host because I didn't have enough. Because I could have been doing research forever, but I will never have enough. And we will never have enough, right? And so just creating those connections and including those materials in the book as part of its own making, I think that's another form of disappropriation, honoring the experience of others as others, honoring their own modes of knowing and being, honoring the work that it entails just to be able to go to an archive, right, to find these documents. I think all that which I'm referring to as labor, it's central also to the notion of disappropriation. So I'm trying, of course, to move away to these romantic notions of inspiration, of this lonely, gifted individual who, against all odds, will tell this story that she knows so well from the very beginning. I mean, all that notion that we so often associate with the word memoir, right? So this would be a way of interrogating both the experience and the format that we've used to deploy these experiences and to make this experience shareable with others. So disappropriation becomes, in that sense, a mode of approaching the materials, but also a way of in terms of the form, is very complicated to see how. Let me rephrase that. Academics have an answer for this. They quote the materials, and there are strict rules about documentation and footnoting and MLA formats or APA or Chicago style and those things. In the creative writing field, when we want to refer to these materials, we want to include these materials. So that's not only an issue of acknowledging the work of others, but also becomes an aesthetic issue. What kind of aesthetic decisions will I be making here to share with my readers that this is part of a larger process and a larger conversations in which the work of others, the text of others, the writing of others is fundamental, is essential, is inescapable. That's something that I was able to answer with, to me, I mean, with the term disappropriation. Obviously, the question remains open for every single project, and every single project will eventually, at least that I'm talking about my own practice here, will eventually find its own specific tone and form and mode of being in the world. That's, to me, that's a task of writing. Is less a story that I'm telling and more a way of creating that material space in which these issues will have to be addressed in the company of others, both as actors in the story, as elements of the storytelling, and obviously as readers into this larger community of sense making.
Yeah, I love this idea that no matter what, we're writing about others and with others. Maybe the best example of it literally in your fiction is when you have Amparo Davila and Alejandra Pizarnik in your work, their words in your work, them as figures in your fictions. Juan Rulfo also, but staying with these, this is a great segue to talk about the non-human in your work too, as another other that often gets erased or not acknowledged as part of the collaborative nature of writing. So like staying with this notion of two stories within a story of Pavanelli and Moten and Le Guin's notion of co-substantiality and your notion of disappropriation. But coming back to your fiction, a first step back towards your fiction, I want to spend a moment with your conversation with Donna Haraway, because much like you talk about both writing and grieving as non-solitary acts, when you two were talking, she seemed to do a similar thing with love, demanding that love is ultimately collective and communal. And I wonder if this is I don't know if this is a misuse of your term disappropriation, but if she's doing a disappropriation of love, because she talked about the monarch butterfly, that if you really love this butterfly, as she does, if when this butterfly arrives to where you live, if she's to take this love seriously, it must extend beyond her own joy around the beauty of the butterfly to all the things that sustain the butterfly's existence. And then she went on to mention one of the principal activists in Michoacan, which is the place where monarch butterflies migrate to and congregate, who was trying to build connections between farmers and forest conservationists, who was engaging around the politics of water in the region and around the tourist industry, how this terribly important conservationist was murdered, and that for her to take her love of the butterfly seriously, if she was going to be worthy of loving the butterfly, her concern needed to extend to that, and also to the plants that the butterfly needs to feed, to the farms and agribusinesses and the pesticides that they use on the land, to the land that has been taken by conquest and by slavery, in what she calls a continuous material tracing of being. I love that phrase. And it feels like you do this with Autobiography of Cotton, which you could say is about, as you've already mentioned, the part of your family that gets pushed south to the cotton fields and the part of your family that moves north to the cotton fields. Both attracted, perhaps in a way like Haraway's butterflies, to a plant. And you could say that this story of your family is really the autobiography of a plant, as your title implies. And you, in fact, do say this. You say it is a history of cotton as I think Cotton would have written it. So this is my long way of asking you to talk about the non-human in your fiction, but I guess maybe most specifically or most commonly seen as a forest that seems to be telling a story somehow that we can't reduce to meaning. It's like a story of the forest is one that we're not able to translate it. It reminds me of Tarkovsky's Zone and in Stalker, or Jeff Vandermeer's Area X. These forces outside of language feel like they are a character in some of your stories, many of your stories, shaping the stories, maybe writing the stories with you, even though we're not able to read them. But there's something about the energy of the forest in your stories that often is part of the mystification happening to your meaning-making characters.
That's, again, a wonderful question. I could organize a whole syllabus, a semester based on that. This is so rich. Let me try to start with the cotton first, and then I'll get to the forest. Even though in my work the forest is first, and the forest is being there very prominently in the Taiga syndrome, of course, and I was reminded of the place of the forest in a short story included in this collection, the Carpathian Mountain Women, and the way in which this enchanted forest of the fairy tales becomes a tale of horrorism too, and extractive economies and capitalism run amok in many ways. So yes, there is that connection that has been very important to me. Is to interrogate the all these romantic notions attached to nature and nature in general, and specifically about the forest, and try to again sediment all these economic, financial, cultural elements that constitute forest as such. So but I said that I was going to be talking about that later, and now I'm talking about that right now. In any case, let me see. I set out to write an autobiography of cotton because I wanted. At the beginning, it was a very long project. I wanted to do a history of my own family based on the crops that have made these lives possible. For my grandparents, it was cotton. For my father, who is a researcher, it was potatoes. That's the reason why we moved to central Mexico. And so I wanted to find links between those two, between cotton and potatoes. And of course, I wanted to listen carefully to the language of both of cotton and potatoes. I don't speak Cottonese. I don't know what is the language of cotton as such, but the language of cotton has been translated through different disciplines, and it's been made knowledgeable to us through labor registers, through bank transactions, through the international market, the financial system, the field of agronomy, the language of fertilizers, the language of soil and soil caring. So there are all these many attempts that we've used as a space to be able to be conversant in Cottonese, to be able to develop these, which is a one-sided and quite hierarchical conversation with cotton. And I was very aware of the tremendously relevance of the connection between cotton and slavery in the history of the United States, and how contrasting was the experience of cotton production on the border, on the US-Mexico border, and the sense of autonomy that it created in these specific communities, at least for certain amounts of time, some 20, 30 years of great growth, economic and otherwise, right? So instead of just talking about the human history of this section of my family, of grandparents that I never knew, or I hardly knew, I wanted the language of cotton to be present. And so I had to resort to the translations that we've used to develop these uneven conversations. And we go back to the beginning of our conversation. It's again a translation, and it's again an unfinished translation, right? It's a translation in which I'm including as much information that I've been digging through all these different research modes, and it's a conversation that in many ways I'm inventing. An imagination that has resulted from the research and not otherwise, right? So I was in the terms used by Donna Haraway, I was taking very seriously that possibility, seriously the work that that specific generation put into producing this crop, and the relationship that emanated of that connection, and eventually the destruction that came as a result of all that, right? The soil degradation and the work of the different plagues that ended this, which was a very successful economic financial story, at least for some 20 or 30 years. So that was my way of bringing cotton into place. I didn't want, this is again, I didn't want to I wanted to interrogate the representations that weighed heavily on cotton as a crop. And I wanted to create a space in which that I think it would be, I can say in which cotton itself spoke, because as I've said, I don't speak that language, but in which the translations that we've been able to gather or to create of this language of the cotton of the language of cotton. So I wanted that to be completely present and to in fact guide all the structure of the book and the responses, the reactions that that members of my family had or developed vis-a-vis the challenges of cotton and the care that came with that. So that was one way of joining this material tracing of being, as you mentioned, and I think the relevance for me of all these of all these elements is just to be relentless about posing those small questions. When we introduce objects in our stories, very often we take all these objects as granted. We don't interrogate them, and here the lessons from George Perec are very useful about the infraordinary. You know, interrogating every single element of the story, interrogating our objects, interrogating our streets, interrogating our names, trying to see where they are coming from. Are there alternative ones? Can we rename things? What is the history of this spoon that I am taking, my soup with? What is it? So if we devote all that time, if we really take this storytelling seriously, we will have to spend much time with all these the smallest of elements as much as we spend with the larger arguments or the larger aspects of our stories. That was my intent with Cotton. Obviously, I could have written this book. I could have spent all my life writing the Cotton story. You know, ends are artificial. We need to end somewhere. And because I believe of ending as an artificial contract, a convention, an artificial convention, that's the reason why it is rather easy for me to go back and say, we need to change that. I mean, this is not how the story was meant to be. That's how the story could be at that point in time. But stories grow, as if we are lucky, stories grow and continue developing in ways that very often escape our own imagination. And so going back to them, approaching them from the point of view of the translator, bringing them back to life, the sediment, all these elements that have petrified in many ways their own structures. I mean, that's part of what I claim writing has done for me as a reader. So that's something that, in a way, comes natural when I go back and revise.
When you talk about interrogating and finding alternatives, it reminds me again of this notion of a double story with Piglia, but also thinking about like the few female journalists that go to the city of men in that story who end up hiding in the forest. And you have lines like, on the outskirts of order grows with great stubbornness another order. It isn't an alternative city exactly, but a series of anti-cities that scattered across the narrow borders survive in constant motion. And then in the story that you mentioned, Carpathian Mountain Woman, we get this repeated line over again, which again reminds me of this Piglian notion of the story. Every forest always has another forest inside of it. And I was hoping you could read just a short passage from that story if you have the book on hand.
Why does someone grab a pair of notebooks, take a long trip on a dilapidated hulk of a bus, get off in a distant province, and then travel on the back of a donkey for days and days in order to reach, if they possibly can, the remotest spot imaginable? I don't know. Why does someone choose a forest? I can't answer that either. There is the green, of course. The abundance of greens that are the color green. You have to learn how to see. There is the fresh air and the sky, this sky blue sky, the solitude of the sky. No one is ever more defenseless than when they know they are alone under the sky. The possibility of remaining silent for hours at a time, days at a time, months at a time, the possibility of forgetting how to write, the possibility of not speaking. There are the extended, callous, dry, brutal hands that can't take up tools to cut, plant, plow. There is the voice, deep, the echo, also deep. The possibility of saying, we have burned all the villages. We have burned all the villages and the people in them. We have adopted their customs and the way of dress. The laughter inside the church walls during the rites, the slow walking down the aisle, the shaking of hands, the endless bowing of heads. There is the crying of babies being born, a deep echo, another one. There is the beginning, the oldest forest, the forest inside the forest, that promise. Listen to this. There is the inescapable fact that we have burned all the villages and the people in them. You can't live in the forest without having a theory of the forest. During burials, when I join the funeral procession, and later, when I look inside the coffin at the dead person's face, it's impossible to avoid wondering if it's worth it, if all of this is worth it. The problem, as always, is the children and the old people. The problem is always the most vulnerable ones, the ones who one fine day abandon the joke and run as fast as they can among the trees, looking for a little light. Sometimes it gets so dark under the trees and so cold. The problem is the ones who lose their minds. You stand there looking at the dark pathways and you wonder about the taste of liquor in the mouth of the man who shovels dirt over all that. The forest means somewhere beyond, everything is in flames. There is a moth that flutters in the air. The blade of the tool has severed the leg. The snow is falling. The nature of snow is to fall. There was snow before. There will be snow afterward. The forest will survive all of that, all of these. In front of the falling house, the illuminated face, an idol. The nature of houses is to fall. The noise of the axe. Soon we will disappear. There is an urgent need to go to the tree. The amputated leg, the trail of blood on the snow, a pair of footprints.
We've been listening to Cristina Rivera Garza read from new and selected stories from Dorothy Project. So before we end today, Cristina, I wanted to spend at least a moment with the new stories that are only available in English that end the collection, many of which are much shorter, less beholden to narrative, more formally varied, and two of them which are doubled in a sense, that are engaged with previous stories. Rothko's Sunrise and The Survivor of Pripyat. They don't feel like sequels. They feel like reanimations or re-envisionings. But talk to us about these, what you've discovered and what you're working through with these new stories which feel more highly experimental and which seem to foreground the mechanics or the something of the mechanics of storytelling in a way, or the scaffolding of storytelling in a way that maybe your earliest stories are trying to conceal.
Yeah, you're right, very right. I think I've used most of these very short stories as places to confront the specific formal challenges. So some of these stories at the end of this volume are related to or come directly from larger works, and I just isolate some of them. I needed to know, for example, in Reincarnation, which is a story told in very on sentences that appear to be disjointed. So I was trying to work against the notion of narration as the unfolding of meaning over time. This was the narration as the unfolding of the problems of making meaning over time in many ways. So I wanted this disjointedness of the sentences to allow me to work with that operation that we've been talking about all throughout this conversation. But it was a way of iterating that possibility in any case. There were some other ones. One, the spi unie mat, that deals with the last speaker of a language, of a dying language too. There and then at the end there are these two stories that you've mentioned that appear at least in two versions, which doesn't mean that there are more versions that I decided not to publish here. So we go back to the topics that we've been addressing throughout these conversations. So now that you put it in this way, so concisely out there, I can clearly see how in the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, I've been very actively engaging and in finishing my stories and in creating versions, new versions, alternative versions of whatever I did in the past or are doing in the present. So it has become a mode of working with my materials. I'm thinking of the way in which I worked with El Invencible Verano de Liliana, which is the book that I just published last year in Mexico. But in the making of the book, I was writing paragraphs, entire pages in Spanish, and then going immediately into English and trying to write a version, which was not necessarily a translation, but a version of what what I've written in Spanish. How would I do that in English? What kind of version? How would the story be affected by the fact that I was talking about these same issues with using the same materials, but with the mediation and the intervention of another language? So it was a very slow process, but essentially at its very core is this version making, and it is the translation of the materials as such. So what we see at the end in the story about Rothko is a translation. It goes from one form into the other, right? One is a narrative and the other one is a villanelle. And let's see how the villanelle, which is a form, is always preventing the conclusion, right? It's keeping the story in its unfinished state. So I wanted to see how that form, which we usually associate with poetry, does to narrative as such. And in fact, that's an exercise that I usually use as a prompt with my students in intro to fiction classes. Is just to see how the genre as such, or specific forms, meter forms, how they interrogate narrative and at times with posing very, very interesting questions to our plots and to our characters in general. So yeah, that's I guess that's what I've been doing. This now that I'm talking with you, I realize that's what I've been doing these last, I don't know, 5-7 years.
Yeah. Well, for your and my unfinished, the way we're going to unfinish our conversation, I wanted to unfinish our conversation. I want to repeat the line from City of Man. On the outskirts of order grows with great stubbornness another order. And it's in this other order, constantly in motion, where the female journalists are hiding from and within the City of Men. I wanted to end with the word stubbornness. If we go to an essay where you talk about stubbornness, we could consider this essay perhaps a conjoined twin to the story City of Men. You say, I'm not an optimist. I'm stubborn. We don't need hope. We need tenacity. There is no contradiction between this constant urging taking to the streets and this entering into the process of writing. we're talking about the right side up and the inside out of the same process. So in this spirit, as our final exchange before the unfinish, what are you engaged with now? What is your work in? What are the animating things for you, or unanswerable questions, or what's driving you to the page, or away from the page, books that have captured you, or books that we can expect from you? Project us into the future for a moment of Cristina Rivera Garza.
Thank you so much, David. It's so interesting that you chose these lines of The City of Man, which is a short story that I've been thinking a lot about, and in fact, I rewrote that several times, and at one point it became a short novel. Perhaps it will be published, perhaps it won't, I don't know. But there were issues in that short story. Most of them had to do with the point of view that I wanted to restructure. I think that it needed some engineering work in that specific story. And when I went back to interrogate every single thing, it turned out that the story needed more pages. And so it became this novel in the making right now. But that's not what I'm doing right now. So when I wrote the autobiography of Cotton, my idea was to continue with the book of on potatoes. It's the Solanum tuberosum diaries. That's how I called that project. And I was trying to write that book when the Invincible Summer of Liliana's Invincible Summer just couldn't. It was just constantly in my mind. And so I just interrupted the other book, and I devoted my time to do the research and interviews and write the story. Now I don't know. I'm tempted to go back to the original pathway and continue with the Solanum tuberosum diaries. And I tried that, but for some reason, and I'm going to go back again to the first question. Instead of writing in this disappropriative mode, I began writing what might as well be called a piece of speculative fiction. And I don't know if I'm going to continue with that. As I said, is fiction. I go back to fiction, but with all the questions that have been nagging me for the last, 10, 15 years. So it's not going to be fiction as I knew fiction before all these years. It's something else. But at the same time, I've been thinking about the whole process of writing Liliana's Invincible Summer and the legal process, the police work that has come as a result of writing the book. And I might be tempted to write a second book related to that process. I'm not so sure, to be honest. So I know that the writing remains in the field of the family. That is very much taking advantage of archival materials, of interviews, field work, all the elements that I've been talking about in regards to disappropriation. So it seems that there is this bifurcation. On the one hand, continuing with this nonfiction, fiction type of work, and on the other hand, perhaps going back and shake hands with fiction now in its more speculative form.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
That's exciting either way.
It is. And perhaps I will end up doing both, right? So I'll just need time.
I hope so.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for spending all of this time with me today, Cristina.
I am very sincere when I say thank you for your questions. They are magnificent. At times, I wish I could, I want to be thinking about those and I'm going to say, no, I have now a better answer. and perhaps I'm going to be, I will find myself calling you and saying, I'm going to record a better answer, but no, that's what I was able to do right now. But you are just amazing. Thank you so much. Really.
Thank you so much too. We were talking today to Cristina Rivera Garza about her new and selected stories from Dorothy Project. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. Today's bonus audio is a long-form conversation with Cristina's translator, Sarah Booker, about everything from questions of authenticity and authorship to feminism and translation activism. This joins Cristina's own contribution to the archive from 2019 of a reading of 3 parts of her long poem, Third World, and conversations with many fantastic translators from Emma Ramadan and Sophie Hughes to Megan McDowell. If you enjoyed today's conversation, help ensure the future of conversations just like this by joining the community of Between the Covers listener supporters at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Access to the bonus audio is just one potential benefit of doing so. Or, if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Jacob Valla in the art department, Becky Kramer in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating the outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog, A Sapatita Me, can be found on iTunes. Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.